So at this point, most fans should know that the well-beloved Yakuza series has made that transition over to the turn-based JRPG series thanks to that massive success from Yakuza 7 Like a Dragon, or just Yakuza 7 or Like a Dragon, however you may refer it, which started off as a joke, funny enough. The Judgment series has now taken that mantle from being that action game that we all knew and loved from the previous older Yakuza games. Now, a big question here is that, is it well deserved? Does Judgment deserve that title or mantle as the successor for Yakuza in a way? I think so, and I think this title, Lost Judgment this time around, speaks much volumes. Welcome everyone to my review for Lost Judgment. I decided to go with a full review this time around because I really think it deserves it once again. Although I think it's funny because I said previously in my Judgment review that I was okay this being like a one-time thing, but boy was I wrong. This was something I had never thought I needed in my gaming life until I played it. Lost is such a perfect word for my playthrough because the amount of sidetracking I did in this game thanks to its content alone. Now, before I unfold this whole review here to you all, please hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button because I gotta say it, and it's really helpful as it is simple to do. So thank you very much. Let's get into the review. Okay, so let's start with the graphics and visuals. As someone who has played this on the PlayStation 5, the first thing I definitely took note of was the smooth 60 frames per second, unlike the previous titles that used the Dragon engine. During the debut of the Dragon engine, the gameplay side of things took a bit of a hit. While the cinematics were really pristine, actually fighting people at 30 frames per second was jarring, especially having older Yakuza games feature 60 frames per second combat. But here with Lost Judgment and the power of modern consoles, we're back at 60 and the cinematics do look good in most regard. My only complaint here is that the cinematics now do have a different feel and look to them in terms of how things move. Movies tend to be filmed at more or less 24 frames per second, so that 30 frames per second did help make that look a little more like a movie and personally enhance my viewing experience as someone who loves watching movies. Though not too long after, I developed a mindset that this is more of a J-drama than ever, since many J-dramas are still filmed at 60 frames per second. Anyway, at the end of the day, I am willing to make this trade for a higher frame rate combat experience, making it more robust overall, since this is a video game after all. So I consider this a minor setback. It is worth noting that these frame rates are thanks to the power of the PlayStation 5, and with that, the loading times are really nice in comparison. The color grading and art direction this time around appears to be more on the neutral side of things, while previously Judgment was heavily stylized. But the color palette is pretty nice, and there is still some level of contrast that is appropriate for a detective themed game, and perhaps easier on more players' eyes in the long run. While I do miss that heavy sort of contrasty style, I can definitely settle for this one. This is kind of like the middle ground here. In terms of fidelity, it can be hit or miss. While higher resolution and good looking on the important bits, some parts such as the NPCs and some environments can use some touch-ups, especially the animals, which would be more nice for console gaming of this generation. This time around, you are going back and forth with the beloved Kamurocho and of course Yokohama, which was previously featured in Yakuza 7. Both places are finely detailed, especially with Yokohama. There are some parts of it being inspired from the real Yokohama itself. But when playing these Yakuza-esque action games, it kind of becomes an afterthought because of the gameplay and the amount of content this time around, as I kind of alluded. The combat itself is overall intact, which means it's more of that fighting and action fans know and love. Lost Judgment does feature the same Tiger and Crane styles, but now throws in a new style called Snake. Tiger tends to be more power oriented, Crane is more for crowd control and speed, and Snake leaning more towards a defensive and parry heavy style. I have fun screwing around with the cronies as I kept landing parries and giving them that sort of Wing Chun looking wallop. Parrying is actually pretty simple as the timing is really lenient, and you can just hold the button at the right time and not tapping for precise timing like I did early on. Snake style is also effective against weapon users, as you can disarm the lesser enemies completely, which is handy later on. Now with that said, when it comes to bosses, it's still quite handy. Snake does have its fair share of cool EX actions as well. Now speaking of AX actions, you do have all the previous ones from Judgment, and to some extent the Yakuza moves. There are some new ones thrown in there depending on the conditions and items you have. Again, if you love the combat from Judgment, then you'll love it here. It's mostly the same with some tweaks here and there. I honestly think the biggest change in the combat is just that 60 frames per second gameplay as mentioned before. It really is appropriate here for our detective Yagami, as he is the agile fighter, and you want all the frames to see the action and react to as well. It just feels good in general. Now technically you can have more styles to play around, but that's locked behind these extracts which you can produce after picking up all those materials that are littered throughout the cities. The gameplay loop remains largely the same as you grind for points to unlock moves. You can also collect skill books throughout the world and side stories. There are plenty of hidden collectibles this time around that have some nice rewards. Now let's talk more about the new updates in the game. One of them does feature a skateboard for you to travel around faster in town without having to take as much taxis as before. While this was nice to get around with, I wish there was some tweaking, such as higher tolerance for sidewalks and pedestrians, meaning if you ever slightly touch any of these things, you'll fall off your board. It felt cumbersome at times, so doing this sort of tweak would have made it a much smoother experience, but it was still nice when you have the clear road. Another new addition to the gameplay are the stealth missions. Now this one felt minimal at best. You hide behind cover and take down enemies as you make your way through. There were times where its somewhat clunky nature does become apparent. There's not that much tension to be felt. You kind of just get through it for the sake of the story, and that's it. There were updates to the central parts of Judgment, such as tailing and chasing your targets. Tailing allows you to freely choose your hiding spots while following your target, so it felt a little more immersive in that sense. When you do get spotted, there is a button to act casual to prevent getting caught completely even if you are in the wide open space. There's also the parkour segments, which makes me feel that Yagami should just do these things freely, you know, climbing up buildings and stuff like that, kind of like Assassin's Creed. That would have been really cool, and a cool opportunity to just add more collectibles of sorts up there, you know, adding more to that gameplay. Otherwise, it's just locked behind these segments and just served as a means to get through the story. The chase scenes did get at least one major change, which this time around, you'll chase them until their stamina runs out essentially, which in my opinion makes it less engaging, as the last game, I believe, lets you catch the target whenever you're just like close enough to them. It feels sensible that way. It feels more immersive in that sense. Otherwise, it's kind of, to me, padding out more of the game to some extent. Much of the drone segments have been reduced in comparison to before, and probably for the best. You'll find yourself doing more of these during the side story mission of things, and finding collectibles and items throughout the cities. These segments at this point pretty much feel like mini games within the main story. Other things to note that there are a few but prominent QTEs and some boss fights which could make or break some players' experiences. And there is one nice feature added to the game, and that's a dog. Yep, this good boy finds you items and is featured in an awesome EX action. Now regarding to the amount of content in Lost Judgment, there is plenty to do, as it is a tradition at this point with these games to get lost in them. players will get distracted from the main story to check out the side stories. This is especially happening here this time around because of the addition of the school stories, which pretty much acts as one huge side story with branching parts, as it features each sort of club like dancing, esports, robotics club, photography club, so on and so forth. And by the end of it, it all comes together, which makes this whole story arc pretty cool to get through. So I think it's worth putting your time into it. Now granted, each club doesn't have the same amount of story. Some of them are more developed, while others are pretty short. It kind of felt like mini games with a story behind it, essentially. There are plenty of mini games in this game, and I mean plenty. The school story segment is unlocked during the main game, and it is pretty long but filled with stories that you do want to check out. With that, you can make this 30-hour game turn into a plus 70 hours type of game, even 100 hours depending on how much you want to complete the game. This game is definitely worth the full price with just that alone. My complaint here is just that I really wish there were some in-game awards for each of the clubs you tend for, especially boxing. How cool would it have been to have some boxing moves added to your EX actions? Although I've heard there is potentially something about a boxing style in the DLC side of things, but I could be wrong. The worst minigame out of all these ones from the school stories is the motorcycle minigame that features that weird camera angle that you're forced to view from, and that makes it kind of obscure and hard to see what's ahead of you at times. Meanwhile, the other side stories outside the school stories are just as lovable as ever, as they balance out that serious nature from the main story with its wacky goofiness as always. It's more of what players love from the overall Yakuza universe. As for more mini-games, the Sega Classic content is pretty cool this time around, as the big one for me was Sonic Fighters, which was something I've never played before until now. Last time it was fighting Vipers, which was another cool opportunity for me to try. So it was certain fun to go through the Sonic Fighters and beating it, but not without experiencing that classic arcade bullshit challenge, but it felt good beating it. For other mini games such as drone racing, they are back as well, like baseball, darts, you name it. Of course, the VR Paradise makes its return, now featuring rivals that you can compete against, featuring characters from the story such as Kaito, Higashi, Sugiura, and so on. This is a great and funner way this time around to grind for money because of these rivals, but it is important to know that getting these play passes this time around are a pain in the ass because they cost so much more and they drop less. However, you can get the free pass quite easily this time around, so it kind of works out in the end as a way of balancing things, if you are willing to put the time into this part of the game for yourself. But now let's talk about the story with some spoilers ahead, but I'll give a warning beforehand. The story here essentially is a two-stage rocket. One part heavily involved with the build-up of the mystery, and the other half involved with all just suspense and thriller. And I really love the story from start to finish, for the most part. The story this time around is a lot darker as it tackles the themes of bullying, depression, and high school students taking their own lives because of that, which is based off of the problem that is pretty common in Japan, sadly, at least for a long time. Lost Judgment does have that sense of build-up this time around, unlike the previous title, which a murder did take place right at the beginning for that game. And the story for the most part involved with Yagami's road to redemption in that game as well. Lost Judgment features a story that involves with a small case to begin with, and it just becomes so much bigger as it goes on. And because of that sense of build-up, Lost Judgment had a more engaging story to me in comparison to Judgment. Not saying that Judgment's story is bad by any means, I really like that story as well. But here in Lost Judgment, because of that build-up, I actually found this story to be a lot more engaging. You're more glued to your seat, you're leaning more forward, and you do want to see what happens next, since there is that buildup and it just explodes at some point in the story. The high school setting for the main story and the school stories was a good opportunity to see Yagami being a much more likable character. You just get to see more of his emotions and stuff like that unfold as he interacts with the students. Although there is little character progression this time around for the boys, the main boys I mean, you just get to know them better in a sense. That progression comes from the new characters you meet throughout the stories, and it feels really good to see how they grow by the end of it. Now this comes at a cost of not seeing much of that friendship between Yagami and Kaito as much. I personally wish for more. Although it was good to see the old faces again, like Sugiura and also Higurashi especially. Even Tsukumo, who was a NPC from before, now he becomes a pretty major side character, and Saori joins in on the fray much more as a major character than before. And this time around, I actually really like the villains here, more so than in the first title, as Judgment only featured some few likable ones, but here you get to see more of that. So that did help with the boss fights as well. I actually really like the boss fights in Lost Judgment over Judgment. The performances by the cast is all around fantastic as before, which really helped with the story way more. And the music is just that icing on the cake, especially with that final boss theme. On top of that, gotta give a shout out to the music during the dance minigame. The story does, at some point, revolve around characters who have different sides or philosophies and views on justice. And you'll feel for both of these sides and have a hard time picking between the two personally, which perhaps could have been an opportunity to present itself to have two different endings. But I think the devs just like to, tell one story, so that's fine by the end of the day. Either way, the story does a pretty good job pitting these two sides against each other, and it just really was hard for me to just outright choose in my mind. By the end of it all, there were some personal details I wish were touched upon or touched up, and it really would have nailed the story even more, which I will now go into spoilers, so skip to this timestamp in the comments or description. So really, this involves with the final parts of the game where Yagami and the boys march in and just crush through everything, the cronies and all, with that badassery. Like, almost like Saturdays are for the boys sort of vibes. I just wish that Tessa was a part of that. That character who sort of appoints himself as a oath brother to Yagami. And so, with what he did with the story, or how involved he was in the story, I thought he should have been part of that sort of final segment as well. While yes, he does help out in the first part of the final arc, or final push, he should have been involved with the boys, But hopefully that'll be something that would happen in the next story. Now when it comes to the end of it, I just wish we'd have known what happens with the suspects and the prosecutor and, the rest of the bad guys. Largely Ehara, Mamiya, and the rest of those who were involved with the murder. They kind of did the same thing with the previous game, unfortunately, so they need to do a better job cleaning up the rest of the loose ends for these stories. Now with that said, it is satisfactory for the most part when it comes to the main part of things. For those who are wondering where it takes place in terms of the Yakuza timeline, this is a couple years after Yakuza 7. You'll get to see some familiar faces from that game. You'll just have to find out for yourself who and where and when, I guess. So by the end of it, Lost Judgment was a thrilling game that featured a detective story, with that fun gameplay, great characters, the music, and not to mention the amount of content, which is insane. So you'll definitely get your money's worth through and through. So with that, I'm actually going to go with a 8.5 out of 10. It is an improvement from Judgment, but that doesn't quite get that, that 9 out of 10 because of the loose ends of the at the finale of the story, the lacking rewards for the school stories, and some of the imperfections within the game that add all up to that. By the way, it's a huge recommendation for those who still love the Yakuza games and action in general, who still sort of thirst for that side of Yakuza. I'd go ahead and play the first game before you get this one, before Lost Judgment, just to see how the series really evolves. Judgment, I think, deserves to continue its stay, and hopefully, that situation with Sega and the talent agency that Yagami's actor is a part of, they get their issues worked out, because the talent agency apparently doesn't like seeing their client in PC games because of the possibilities of the mods that these characters tend to go through, so they don't want to have their actor, I guess, like defaced in a way. So that's why there's a problem there. And Sega slash Yuga Studios insist on trying to get these games on PC to eliminate any exclusivity of sorts. So they're really butting heads at this point. Hopefully they can work things out, but if it doesn't, this could pretty much mean that we don't get to see Yagami anymore in future Judgment games, which is a damn shame, because I would love to see this Judgment series continue at this point, now that I played Lost Judgment. So again, it'd be a damn shame, and at least the ending didn't really imply that there is a new game of sorts. There's no like after credit scene or anything like that, but just thinking about the situation and the possible future for the game, it'd be a damn shame. It's a really good series, if you really like Yakuza games, so I hate to see the game or the franchise just kind of end it on that note. But all in all, great game. Go out and get it. It's either way, it's a good experience in my opinion. So thank you very much. This has been my review for Lost Judgment. If you have any comments or anything to that sort, leave it down below, and don't forget to again hit the thumbs up, like the video or whatever, and hit the subscribe button, because it really helps out and I do highly appreciate it. Again, thank you guys so much for tuning in for my review for Lost Judgment. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you guys in the next video. Sean out.